A trio of American economists, including former Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke, won this year's Nobel Prize in Economics on Monday for laying the foundation of how world powers now tackle global crises like the recent pandemic or the Great Recession of 2008. The winners, who also include Douglas Diamond and Philip Dybvig, won for their research on how regulating banks and propping up failing lenders with public cash can stave off an even deeper economic crisis, such as the Great Depression of the 1930s.
The laureates have provided the foundation for our modern understanding of why banks are needed, why they are vulnerable, and what to do about it. And we can also note that even though the financial crisis had large consequences, neither that nor the COVID pandemic led to depressions like in the 30s.
Bank bailouts in the 2008 recession triggered a wave of public criticism as ordinary consumers suffered, with many losing their homes even as banks, a key culprit of the crisis, were saved. But research done by the trio suggests society on the whole benefited, said one of the three laureates himself, University of Chicago professor Douglas Diamond.
Probably in the last analysis, I think it probably would have been better if Lehman Brothers had not collapsed unexpectedly.
Ben Bernanke was the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve at the time of Lehman's collapse, which became one of the main catalysts of the crisis, but he argued at the time that there was no legal way to save the investment bank, so the next best thing was to let it fail and use the government's financial resources to prevent wider systemic failures. Part of that response, including ultra-low interest rates and massive central bank asset buys, are being reversed now as inflation is at its highest level in about half a century. The three winners will receive an equal share of the nearly $900,000 in prize money.
California's historic drought has threatened crops, driving up prices on produce and putting another strain on budgets already stretched thin by inflation.
A tomato crop will take about 24 to 28 inches of water to grow the way we're doing it. And if we don't have that water, we just won't grow it.
Aaron Barcelos planted just a quarter of the 2,000 acres of his family's fourth-generation farm in Central California. This summer, he harvested tomatoes 2 weeks early to prevent further drought damage. He says this year's tomato crop is only 10 to 15% of what it would normally be.
Right now, we're in a field that we're harvesting probably 2 weeks early because the heat has just brought it on sooner, and these tomatoes are starting to go bad where they're not going to be usable if we don't get them off pretty soon.
Central California, an area known as the U.S. Salad Bowl, has suffered from a lack of rain and snow, and restricted water supplies from the Colorado River have withered summer crops like tomatoes and onions. Leafy greens grown in winter are also threatened, with no end in sight. The rise in food prices in 2022 helped drive U.S. inflation to its highest levels in 40 years. California's drought, on top of Hurricane Ian ravaging citrus and tomato crops in Florida, is likely to push food costs even higher.
It's tough. It's not fun.
R. Greg Pruitt is a sales and energy manager at Ingomar Packing Company, a tomato products supplier.
As the crop gets shorter and shorter, there becomes times when you have to have conversations with customers about not being able to pack their entire volume, which is something that we very much like to avoid. But in situations like this, when you're dealing with Mother Nature and she doesn't cooperate, then sometimes those are tough conversations that you need to have.
The most recent drought in California began in 2020, worsening with the Central Valley's driest January and February in recorded history.
Water is our number one resource. In California, we're basically a desert out here in the Central Valley. We get 6 to 8 inches of rainfall a year on average, and we haven't seen that since 2017, 2018. So we can't grow any of these crops you see behind us without water.
At least 25 people died and some 50 people are missing in Venezuela due to floods and landslides caused by extreme rain over the weekend. The downpour flooded 5 small rivers and swept large debris from surrounding mountains into the town of Las Tahirias, 40 miles or 67 kilometers southwest of Caracas, damaging businesses and farmland. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez said a month's worth of rain had fallen in just 8 hours, and that pumps used to power the community's drinking water system were carried away in the floodwaters. Many people are feared to be trapped under the mud and rocks, including the brother of resident Scarlett Jalindez.
We need help. Please help rescue people because we do not know if people are buried. I have a missing brother. We need support. It is not only my pain, it is the pain of all the people who are here.
President Nicolás Maduro said in a tweet that he had designated the area a disaster zone and had declared 3 days of mourning. And in Nicaragua, Tropical Storm Julia made landfall on the country's Caribbean coast over the weekend, forcing more than 13,000 families to evacuate and leaving 1 million people without power. Julia on Monday moved along the coast of El Salvador toward Guatemala, with Salvadorian authorities reporting at least 9 deaths, including 5 soldiers. At least 5 more died in Honduras. The National Hurricane Center said heavy rains could cause life-threatening flash floods and mudslides across Central America as the storm weakens.
Well, once I heard the voices of the committee members whose voices I actually knew, I was sure this was for real. Didn't actually think it was a prank. I mean, who's going to call somebody at 3:45 in the morning? It wouldn't be a very good prank. You'd be tired for a couple of days from waking up that early. But I was very, very happy to find out it was not a prank, that's for sure. It's certainly a very nice thing to have received. Phil Dybvig and I wrote our paper in a way that was as simple as we could possibly make it, even though it had a certain amount of mathematics in it, so that people like bank regulators and policymakers could understand it. So probably the most gratifying thing for us is that policymakers actually seem to understand it, and the insights that we had, which are pretty simple, could be used in the actual financial crisis. Certainly in 2008, people understood that part of what happened after Lehman was a panic, a fear itself issue, and that the response to getting confidence back was an important part of dealing with that crisis.
Wall Street ended lower on Monday as investors worried about the impact of more interest rate hikes ahead of highly anticipated consumer price inflation data later this week. The Dow fell about 1/3%, the S&P 500 dropped 0.75%, while the Nasdaq shed a full percent, posting its lowest close since July of 2020. Jimmy Lee is CEO of the Wealth Consulting Group.
I just think that today what's going on is that the investors are not convicted one way or the other what to do, meaning we're not sure if the Fed's going to be able to orchestrate a soft landing. And by their own words, if they do, it's going to be a very narrow path that they're going to be walking down to make that happen. And the problem with today or the near term is that we just don't know yet. And so what they've been clear on is that until they see some consistent data on inflation looking a lot better, they're not going to change their rhetoric.
Chip makers sank further Monday with the Philadelphia SE Semiconductor Index touching a 2-year low after the Biden administration announced restrictions aimed at hobbling China's semiconductor industry. Microsoft was among the biggest drags on the 3 major indexes, while Apple and Meta Platforms were each able to eke out about 0.25% gain. And Twitter shares gained, making their biggest move since Tuesday when billionaire Elon Musk said that he would go ahead with his original offer to buy the company.